Anyways, I've went on for a little bit too long. Um, I'm going to backtrack here, and welcome to the DGD podcast. I was muted and didn't even realize it. Thanks for calling that out. But listen, and there we go. We are better to go. So the show is brought to you by our friends over at Alumni Hall. Alumni Hall, 10 minutes away from campus in Athens. Check them out in store or online. That's www.alumnihall.com. Listen, if you have, if you prefer Nike or Cutter and Buck, Columbia, they've got that, right? All licensed Georgia gear, 10 minutes away from campus. So it's right there in Athens. Like I said, go check out Alumni Hall or their website, alumnihall.com. Check them out, get you some stuff, tell them DGD sent you. And welcome to the DGD podcast. We're bringing on our friend Bryce Koon. He covers in a little bit here. And then obviously Juan will be here as well. In the meantime, let's talk a little bit about Georgia, right? Georgia. Obviously, the news over the weekend, Andrew Paul, right? I think that's something that we need to discuss a little bit briefly. And obviously, if you're not aware of the news, torn ACL, out for the season. And what does that mean for Georgia, right, in the running back room? Well, one, you're 5 deep. Now you're looking at 4, and fair. So my expectations are Branson Robinson will probably get more looks. And that's kind of, to me, common sense, but neither here nor there. I think you look at Branson Robinson is going to be asked to step up. Listen, Kirby Smart values 5 backs. It just does. So how does that play a role, right? You're going to see these guys, Kenny and Kendall, right, if they stay healthy, take a lot of the reps. Dejon Edwards, I think, deserves a lot of reps as well. Just does. So, I think the interesting thing here is now you can't really afford, and it's first world problems, I guess, another injury in the running back room, right? Because then you're left with 3 running backs, and we're already down to a point where Kirby probably feels a little bit uncomfortable, right? But this is why you have 5 backs deep. You just do. You just do. So, obviously the brigade, let us know what your thoughts are about this, and we'll kind of take some talking points there away from it. However, I think for the most part, right now that you're looking at game prep for Oregon, let's be honest. I think for the most part, we had a fairly safe camp, right? You don't see any true major injuries outside of the Andrew Paul situation. And that's good, right? You have a little bit, you're going to get dinged up. That's just what's going to happen. And let's just be honest. Let's call a spade a spade. It's going to happen. You're going to get dinged up. But you didn't really have any significant injuries, like I said, outside of the Andrew Paul situation. So, and Michael B here says as well, he's not worried as well, but would be worried if another running back got injured. Exactly. Project Pat says, good morning, brigade. Top of the morning to you. And let's see. Also, ESPN makes a bold prediction, guys, for Florida. Not for Florida, but for Georgia. I got Florida on the Broncos. I can't wait to beat Florida. I've been talking about that all morning. So let's see here. So they've got, ESPN has basically Georgia making it to the playoffs, right? Basically making it to the playoffs. 6 consecutive New Year's Six Bowl play at the semifinal at the Fiesta Bowl in Arizona. However, they have the Buckeyes beating Georgia and facing Alabama in the playoffs. What are your thoughts on that, right? For the brigade, what are your thoughts on that? My thoughts on Ohio State, I need to see what kind of run defense you're going to bring out. You have to stop the run better than what you did last year. And if you don't, it won't matter. It won't. The success, when you look at teams like Georgia, Alabama, and even Clemson for this matter, they're built deep for that matter, inside. It's built inside out, not outside in. You can't do that and sustain, right, national championship title runs, right? Just can't. So, in my opinion, it's going to matter who's going to win up front. It's just what's going to happen. So, looking at that situation right there, I understand the logic behind of it, but I don't understand necessarily the logic of them. I could see it going either way. Yeah, I really could. So, I thought that, I get it, right? You're hearing a lot of media talking about this. And this is perfect right here. They hire a DC, and the media says it's fixed, right? Ohio State gets the benefit of the doubt when Georgia doesn't. I mean, Georgia just won a damn national title, but still don't get the benefit of a doubt. It is what it is. Just go out and prove it, right? And kind of chiming in here on that situation, Ohioans are slightly overvalued. We're undervalued. It's a fair point. It really is. Listen, I think they're going to get better. Excuse me. I think their defense is going to get better. I just don't know how much better, right? And how soon. It's not that they don't have the talent. I just need to see schematics, in my opinion. That's just what I think is going to happen. You really need to, to focus in on that. And if you don't, listen, you still got to get past Michigan State. You still got to get past Michigan, right? Let's not forget the fact that run defense got gashed by Oregon and Michigan for that matter, right? They took losses to both of those teams last year. Now, it's not the same team. I get it. I completely get that. But you have to make the change. Will it be enough? Offensively, they're as deep as any team in the country. There's no question about that. We're not going to sit here and argue that notion. We're just not going to. It would be stupid for me to do that. But when it comes to defense, I think there is some questions. Right, Georgia's got our questions. Ohio State does as well. Ohio State has to have those questions solved. Will they be solved? Listen, the Big Ten isn't really a slouch conference anymore, especially on their side of the division. In their division, when you've got teams like Michigan State and Michigan, I'm not even going to try to compare them, but that's a difficult slate. You got Penn State, you've got Michigan, you've got Michigan State. Michigan State with Mel Tucker has really made strides to become a formidable threat in the Big Ten. And you could say that they've made those strides. So, until that's solved and they go through their slate handling business, you probably should expect that. But will they is a question. I'm sure they will, but you never know. If they do, hey, maybe you do see Georgia in the playoffs, right? But I think this year, and it's going to be interesting because you hear Clemson be in this situation where they're going to be back in the playoff hunt. Fair. But there's, every team's got questions. And I think even Alabama does to some degree. Let's be honest here. Even Alabama does because, yes, you have Will Anderson, best player in college football. Fair point. You've got Bryce Young. Fair point. How are you going to handle that from an offensive standpoint, right? Like, look at the receivers. Are they going to make those steps up? I think so, right? You got Jermaine Burton, listen, and then the offensive line. How is the offensive line going to hold up? Right? I don't have a problem with their defense. I think their defense will be just fine. Just fine. And if this comment is accurate, holy cow. Michael B says, in all fairness, I believe ESPN article had Miami as the fourth team. Nobody's picked them. Well, then, that's interesting. Completely interesting is all I'm going to say. I don't know about that just yet. I really don't. So, let's see here. The fact that they think that Alabama and Ohio State are above the rest and like head and shoulders above the rest, I don't necessarily believe that. Listen, I'm taking the red and black glasses off here, folks. this defense is built to reload. It's not a rebuilding situation at all. It's built to plug and play, right? Even the guys that are returning from last year play, even if they didn't start technically, played so much that they're basically, basically just built to, just plug and play. We saw it last year. I don't see that changing, right? I mean, and let's be honest, I'm expecting a situation where you'll have situations where your linebackers, your DBs will get tested. Let's be honest, we're going to get tested more this season than we did last season, and that's okay, completely okay. Georgia, in my opinion, will get back to the playoffs, and we'll see what happens from there, whoever decides to go make it to the playoffs with us. That's my prediction. We'll talk more about that. But we're going to take a quick break, and after this break, we'll be joined. We are back, and Bryce, welcome to the show, my man.
Awesome, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity, and man, we are almost there. We are so close to college football.
Yeah, I'm sitting here. I'm sitting here just getting so anxious. It feels like even with the teams that we're about to watch this weekend, right? Because let's be honest, football starts this weekend, not next, this weekend, if you want to call it that, right? Let's be honest. Some of these games, I'm not sure about how it's going to play out, like aesthetically, but it's football. You're going to watch it, right? You're just going to watch it. But nonetheless, like I said, welcome to the DGD podcast. Tell the people a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, of course. Appreciate you having me on. I cover Georgia Tech for 24/7 Sports, but a little bit of everything. You mentioned, talking about week 0. I'm also on the radio team for Mercer, FCS program, and so we start this week. So we're playing a week 0 game, so it'll be a lot of fun. And then also host a show down here in Columbus, Georgia. It's on the radio throughout the state of Georgia, the Crowded Booth. So we actually it's hilarious because obviously I have a Georgia Tech following, but our next 2 episodes are kind of previewing with a beat writer talking about Georgia. So, hey, you got to cater to all audiences, and everyone knows the Dogs are a big deal here in the state of Georgia.
I mean, no doubt, right? Obviously, we're talking Georgia Tech here today. Yeah, but listen, I want to ask you one question first, and with the chat situation here too, maybe get your thoughts on this as well, Brigade. Overall, right? Do you think, right? I think with how the game of college football is changing, right? The expansion talks, things like that, and even the playoff talks. Do you think the clean old-fashioned hate? If you look at conference expansion, like there's been talks that, maybe Georgia and Georgia Tech need to split it and add a different matchup. What are your thoughts overall? Should Georgia and Georgia Tech continue to be played yearly, or do you think that they should kind of split off and look for a different matchup, for moving forward with the expansion talks?
Yeah, I think the question almost lies a little bit more in the fact of would both sides be willing to kind of, not play anymore? And I think you go back to 2020 when it was pretty obvious they were okay with not playing it. A lot of those ACC, SEC rivalries didn't happen during the COVID-shortened season. And so I think that, depending on where this goes with expansion, and, every single day there's a new rumor that hits the Twitter sphere about what's going to happen. I think the more it expands, the more likely it becomes that this game is not as prominent to be, I think it doesn't have to be as prominent because right now, and I tell Georgia Tech fans this all the time, right now, and I know your viewers probably feel the same way, is Georgia really doesn't look at this game anything more than a tune-up for a potential SEC title game and or bowl game. This is an opportunity, and we go back to last year, it was never really in doubt who was going to win the game from the opening kickoff. I was in the stadium there, and I'm kidding, not kidding, 85-15 Georgia fans at the home stadium of Georgia Tech. So I think, it's going to be really tough, and I can see the comments, Michael up there on YouTube's. I agree with you. I think it's going to be really tough for them to keep this game because Georgia's done a very good job, in my opinion, of scheduling very good non-conference games. Well, obviously, they have the Chick-fil-A kickoff game this year. They've done a very good job of scheduling higher tier games. And if you have a chance to go play Oregon's, the Clemson's, anyone else against a Georgia Tech, when we know that it's going to count more and more or how you want to get into a playoff, I think the Georgia Tech game could fall by the wayside. That rivalry just doesn't mean as much as it did even when Paul Johnson was around. Paul Johnson didn't have a ton of success.
Yep.
Yeah, Paul Johnson didn't have a ton of success, but there were a couple of years, even in Athens, he was able to win those games. And so it's either going to take a complete resurrection of a program like Georgia Tech to make it matter more, or I think Georgia's going to be really okay because of, the heightened schedule to really try to find a more marquee game. And as we saw, I think this plays into it with me being on the media side of things. That deal the Big Ten just made, money-wise, look, marquee games are going to carry more weight for conferences and programs, and that trickle-down effect is going to see games like this one that's not really competitive. I always make the joke, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia. We are right in the middle of Auburn country, right here on the Chattahoochee River in Midwest Georgia. And I tell people, right now, clean old-fashioned hate is a time for people to get over their Thanksgiving food coma to watch the Iron Bowl at 3:30. That's what it is. And so people really don't watch that game unless you're a diehard Tech or Georgia fan. And so I think, I agree. I think this game could go by the wayside if things continue to trend the way they are.
I look at it this way, Bryce. I look at it as, from a historical standpoint, I completely understand it. The historical aspect of it. It makes you value that rivalry. It makes you understand the foundation, the build to this rivalry. Mm-hmm. But like you said, in recent memory and moving forward in the future, is it going to be feasible, right? Yeah. If the SEC does, when you add Texas, Oklahoma, 9 times out of, I guess you said 90%, feels the same way that you're going to add 9 conference games, right? Mm-hmm. Now, will that take away the Georgia Tech game, or will it take away one of those cupcake games that you have, right? Yeah. In Georgia, one of the things that I'm loving under Kirby Smart is the willingness to go out there and be aggressive and schedule marquee non-conference matchups. Even look at what happened last year, right? We didn't have Clemson on the schedule last year, but in a matter of a month or so, right, it flipped, and we both bought out the games because both teams understood that, the importance of it. Bought out the games, right? Paid $1 million or whatever it was. Set the game up. And that aggressiveness is going to have to be the norm for teams like Georgia, like Bama, in my opinion, moving forward, especially with the expansion talks, right? Mm-hmm. Not only from the conference, but the playoff expansion, right? How do you rank your seeding? I think that's the big topic there. But you alluded to the TV deals, right? SEC wise, right? I think it looks in a situation where there's so many SEC games already that the marquee non-conference matchups are just going to be icing at this point. Whereas when you look at conferences like the Big 12 and the ACC, those are your crutches, like almost, right? Like you have Clemson, you have Miami, Florida State markets, right? But we don't know what's going to happen, right? If the Big 10 or the SEC are going to pick these teams out of conference, and that could decimate the entire conference. So adding these marquee non-conference matchups is going to help drive the TV revenue that the ACC, Georgia Tech, the ACC need to stay. Yeah. So in my opinion, I think Georgia might try to push away from it and look to adding another, maybe a Big Ten matchup every year. Who knows? Kind of similar to what SEC Big Ten in basketball, something like that, or something similar, I should say. But Georgia Tech might want to keep the Georgia game, right, because of the TV revenue. Even if Georgia fans outnumber Georgia Tech fans at home, right? I think it's just a matter of filling in seats for that matter. It's a matter of TV revenue. Not knocking Georgia Tech, but until Georgia Tech gets back to that prominent level where they were under Paul Johnson at times, it becomes an afterthought, right? Like, I remember the days when Paul Johnson had Demaryius Thomas. It was one of those things where, like, even, obviously it wasn't Kirby Smart versus Paul Johnson, but Georgia Tech there were times where you actually played a tough game and a close game to that matter. Yeah. Now, from the rivalry standpoint, if we saw more of that, I'm content with keeping the rivalry there. But if the trend continues what we've seen since 2016 and when Kirby Smart got here, that's when it really starts to worry me, because how will the playoff committee value that type of win? It's a rivalry win, but it's kind of like a South Carolina Clemson thing. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Clemson fans probably, they hate them, but they probably want something better than the South Carolina game in their opinion. Now, it's probably a little bit more competitive depending on how you view things, but you get what I mean. It's kind of that same model. But if Georgia Tech's competitive, I think the rivalry would stay and be fine. Like, you just got to get Georgia Tech into that situation, which kind of leads me to my next question. What's the pulse of the program in regards to how the fan base feels with Jeff Collins and the staff throughout this offseason, heading into the season?
Yeah, obviously heading into the season, they've got that marquee matchup against Clemson, kind of the second game of the Chick-fil-A kickoff series. Georgia and Oregon playing Saturday, Tech and Clemson playing on Monday night. But yeah, look, the pulse of the fan base, I think that's a good twofold question, because the fan base, we're constantly reminding the fan base of, and the coaching staff is as well, it's not easy to make this change that they've made. And that's a tired point for a lot of people, but I think it is also widely understood outside of the Georgia Tech fan base that you had offensive linemen that were not built to play at the Power 5 level, whether that's with size or the combination of size and speed and quickness. If you just did a roster comparison of what Jeff Collins inherited to other programs who are trying to run a spread offense, it just wasn't there. And so I'm always in the camp of, you should give a head coach at least 4 to 5 years to figure it out, because he's got to get a full rotation of his recruits, his players. But it's so complicated because the fan base, obviously, we talked about them earlier. They point back to what Paul Johnson did. And this is my reminder to fans. Look, if there's been a lot of claims, well, let's just go hire Jeff Monken in the offseason and let's go run the triple option. And I tell them this. I say, if you want to do that, that's fine. That's okay. I understand the frustration with where this program is right now. But do not expect to ever have a chance to be a consistent contender in your conference, consistent contender at the national level ever. Don't expect that. You can't run the triple option and do that. Now listen, you can run variations of it. Coastal Carolina does a great job of it.
In today's college football world, Bryce, it's impossible to succeed to that level.
Yeah,
running triple option. And the reason why I say that is this. When I was in high school, now I get it, right? This was many moons ago. But really, the way to beat a triple option team is just have speed and discipline. And speed is abundant these days in college football, right? Now I get it. Yeah. Well, it's all around speed. The scheme of the triple option, right? You're keying on someone. So if anybody is not familiar with the option offense, basically, the quarterback and the running backs, things like this, their main goal is to read a key, right? A key. That's it. A player that's designated as the key read. And you react, in a sense, off of what they do, right? So your goal is to be right all the time. What they do is wrong. And if you do it accurately, that's what will happen. But the situation, what you're seeing, like with Georgia, right? We'll take it just this past season, Bryce, this as a vantage point for what we saw. With how much speed this Georgia team had last year, imagine trying to run a triple option offense against that defense. Not only do you have interior offensive line or interior defensive linemen, for that matter, creating havoc and could probably push, bull rush the center back to the mesh point. You can honestly see outside linebackers and edge rushers play contain and just wreak havoc because, for instance, say if you had Trayvon Walker, right, as your key last year, try sitting there and telling him to run down, right, like a hard crash, but still have the ability to rebound and make the play, because I guarantee that's what happens because he's long. He's 6'6". And what you were pointing right here, if you're trying to run the option offense as your base offense, I do not see any form of success. With Paul Johnson, Paul Johnson did it so well that it was scary good. It was scary good.
Yeah. And he was a guy that, I mean, obviously had success at Navy. And he at Georgia Southern. I mean, he was a guy who won championships. And so, kind of going back to the pulse of the program, I mean, there's frustration with 3 consecutive seasons. But I'll say that there is talent on this roster. And we saw last year with what they did against North Carolina in Mercedes-Benz. I mean, that was them at their best. And that was a dominant performance. So they had 10 tackles for loss in the first half alone. They finished up with 16. I mean, that's crazy to think about. They were, we said earlier, wreaking havoc against a North Carolina team that came into the season highly touted, didn't live up to those aspirations. But I think that the biggest thing going forward is that this year we've got to see some type of taking a step forward. They did a lot of positive things with offensive coaching staff, bringing in Chip Long, who's had some success as offensive coordinator. And when I say success, Georgia fans are like, well, okay, we just come off a national championship. But for a Georgia Tech team, getting a guy that was pretty successful at Notre Dame, winning double-digit games, cultivating a quarterback like Ian Book, who Georgia fans got to see up close, who was a solid college quarterback, one of the more winningest quarterbacks in Notre Dame history. They bring in a guy like that. They bring in a quarterback coach. This is the crazy part, for the first time ever. In a long time. And his name's Chris Winkie, former Heisman Trophy winner. The reviews from him have been very positive from the players. And so they're building, I mean, they have a staff now that has Power 5 level coaching experience that they didn't have before. So it's an arms race, as we know in college football. I know after the national championship game, they released that graphic. I think it was ESPN talking about, the how big and deep the staffs were for both Georgia and Alabama, from an analyst staff to everything. Georgia Tech just hired their first offensive analyst 2 years ago. I mean, this is something that they just don't have, and so it's something that there's the powers that be. Paul Johnson did a lot with a little. You really didn't have to do too much. You just had to get some really good athletes and disciplined players. Option, and that's not a knock on the players that came through there, because there's a lot of great players that played for Georgia Tech during the option era. But now you got to play with the big boys. You're trying to recruit the same kids that some bigger schools are getting, some stuff like that. So, the Tulsa fan base is frustrated, but anxious to see where the season goes. And I know we may talk about it, but the schedule is not forgiving at all for Georgia Tech this year. I mean, you talk about non-conference scheduling, you're going to have Georgia on the docket. You throw in another SEC school in Ole Miss, and then they got to go to UCF, which is not an easy place to play for anybody outside of maybe your top 15 programs. That's going to be it's going to be a tough sledding this year for Jeff Collins.
Absolutely. And what I want to do here, we will talk about the schedule in just in a little bit, but I want to talk about recruiting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we'll do is we'll take a quick little pause, and then we'll go and we'll jump on this back of this break here. We'll talk recruiting and how excuse me, how Jeff Collins and Georgia Tech are handling recruiting, from an addition and a subtraction standpoint. So after this break, we'll hop on and talk recruiting. All right, Bryce, we are back. What I want to talk first, though, right, is recruiting. And, there are some key pieces, right? And I think a key piece for that matter, Jahmyr Gibbs. I think that's the elephant in the room if you're a Georgia Tech fan, right? Mm-hmm. Now he is at Alabama. And if you're a Georgia fan listening to this and you're wondering why we're talking about Georgia Tech or whatever the case may be, listen, one rival, probably star player, just transferred to another rival of ours. Mm-hmm. It's important, folks. It's important. Yeah. My main question, I guess my first question is this. How does Georgia Tech rebound after losing Jahmyr Gibbs to the portal?
Yeah, so this is going to sound crazy, and I'll start it off with saying Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a kid that's going to be in a lot of Heisman conversation at Alabama. He is an unbelievable athlete, and accounted for 1,200 all-purpose yards with a offensive line that was leaky constantly. So for him to be able to do what he did, it's scary for the potential of what could happen. God forbid any injuries or anything like that behind an Alabama team that's obviously a more well-oiled machine, has a lot more weapons, where he's not the focal point constantly of an offense. And that's what he was at Georgia Tech. If you shut down Gibbs, you shut down that offense. And that happened a lot last year. But I think this is where it might sound crazy is Jahmyr Gibbs is only playing college football for one more year. He's going to play his junior season, his third year. And he's going to enter himself in the NFL draft where he has potential to be one of the top 5 running backs taken next April. So I say this cautiously because Georgia Tech was not going to win a championship with Jahmyr Gibbs. They weren't. They were not going to win much of anything with Jahmyr Gibbs. There were way too many holes on the roster as a whole to be able to really be competitive with Jahmyr Gibbs at the running back position. So why it is a massive blow. You never want to lose a guy that I said from his freshman year, the conversation I have with a lot of people was between him and Tank Bigsby. They both came in the same year, Auburn's running back. And if Gibbs had been on a better team, he would have received a lot of the attention, media attention, that Bigsby's received. Bigsby, as we know, probably the best player on Auburn's offense, a bell cow running back, one of the top running backs in the SEC. So I think you have to replace it. And look, they did a good job of it. They brought in new running backs coach Mike Daniels, who has fantastic energy, a good recruiter. They bring back a guy. They get a guy from Buffalo, where Daniels came from, and Dylan McDuffie, who is a 1,000-yard rusher. And I don't care what level you're playing at, whether it's Group of 5, Power 5. You rush for 1,000 yards, you got to be doing something right. And so they bring in him. He's a good option. They have Dante Smith, who's been a really, really under-the-radar option for Tech, and really has been the most consistent back. Gibbs battled some injuries. Jordan Mason was in and out sometimes. He's been the most consistent guy over the past 2 to 3 years. And then they brought in transfer Hassan Hall from Louisville, who had over 1,000 all-purpose yards the past 2 years, a dynamic returner, and a one-cut burner type of guy. So they have rebounded nicely if you have the viewpoint of you weren't going to win anything potentially more than you will this year with Jahmyr Gibbs. Because that's my take on it is he's a fantastic athlete. I'm not taking anything away from the kid, but there are way too many holes on this roster for it to be as you can't say, well, now that's a 3-game loss now because we don't have him anymore. If it's a quarterback, completely different conversation we're having. But I just don't know if he had the impact because of the holes on the roster that many people and fans think immediately, and outside the Georgia Tech realm think immediately of how much it's going to hurt this program. Because let's just say, they won 3 games last year, and let's say they win 3 games this year. I don't know if you can say, I'm going to put a running back in there and he's going to win a game by himself. That's a special type of player. That's a Reggie Bush type of player. I mean, that's
a transcendent type player.
Yes. And so at the running back position, it's really hard to make that type of impact. And I think they have a solid group. They just lost one of college's best running backs that nobody really knows about. And people are going to know about him this year because he's playing on a team that's going to have a national time slot every single week.
Yeah. Now, I'll tell you another player on Georgia Tech that I'm interested in. I like his game, and that's Blake Sims. That's your quarterback. I like what Sims brings to the table. I just feel like there's not an offensive line to really work around, and the talent now that Gibbs is gone is really questionable. So, it's going to be interesting to see how he handles things. But I really do like Sims and how he plays the game. You talk about, obviously replacing him and things like that. And what I want to bring up here is, you talk about the holes to fill and things like that. In 22 cycle, Georgia Tech finished 44th overall, right? You had a transfer ranking of 19. Now, this is based off of 24/7 with a composite ranking of 54. But overall, I'm going to say 44. So from a high school standpoint, it looks like 54th overall. And you're right now, you're right around that same area, but we all know it's only August. There's still some time to go. From overall, I think recruiting has to get better. But I think, let's be honest, wins help recruiting. That's just what happens, right? The more you win, the easier it is to recruit. There's no question about it. No question about it. Which kind of leads us from the recruiting point, since we're talking about trying to win games, to the scheduling aspect of Georgia Tech's schedule for this year. And I'll pull up a graphic here. And what I want to do is kind of get some insight into these games, right? And I think ultimately we'll kind of get a feel for, I know you mentioned earlier, it's going to be a daunting schedule for Georgia Tech. And I want to look at it and kind of see what it looks like just from a high level standpoint, not even Georgia Tech related. I just want to see what it's about. So if you're watching, we'll pull this up, but if you're listening, I'll explain the first half of the season for Georgia Tech. With that being said, your first matchup is in Atlanta at the Benz, though, the Chick-fil-A kickoff part 2 with Clemson. Then you host Western Carolina and Ole Miss, followed by trips to Central Florida and Pitt. And then follow that up with coming back home to play Duke. Looking at this first half of the schedule, right? You look at Clemson defensively, one of the better defenses in college football, specifically on the offense or defensive line. Western Carolina is an interesting team, but I think Georgia Tech should be able to handle their own there. And then Ole Miss, right, with Lane Kiffin, that offense is very high powered. And then UCF has no slouch with Gus Malzahn. Pitt is reigning conference champion, right? Even without Kenny Pickett, now we'll see what happens there. But that's still a conference champion the past year. And then from a standpoint right here, I think this is going to be probably the easier game, maybe even easier than Western Carolina, and that's at Duke. If I'm looking at this schedule or this half of the schedule, Bryce, I've got maybe 2 and 4. 2 and 4 in this first half before the bye. I mean, what do you think? And maybe provide a little bit more analysis than I could into this schedule.
Yeah, I mean, look, 2 and 4 is kind of where I've sat with wins over Western Carolina and Duke. I mean, arguably, and this is what national media has said, that Georgia Tech's roster is probably almost dead last in the ACC talent-wise, but just ahead maybe of Duke, and that's where Duke. And I love Duke's head coach. They brought in Mike Elko from Texas A&M. I think he's going to do a fantastic job. There was time for a changing of the guard there. But that first, man, that's a gauntlet. That's not easy whatsoever. And it almost feels like the athletic administration was kind of like, we're trying to set Jeff Collins up to get fired with this first part of the schedule.
It honestly kind of feels that way.
It's rough. It's rough. So look, Clemson week 1. I tell the fans this, on our show, the only thing, in my opinion, that Georgia Tech has going for in week 1 is that there is a firm belief among people that Dabo Swinney wants to start Cade Klubnik. He does not want DJ to start. DJ has not separated himself from week 1 or from start of last camp. Still, yeah, the kid's talented. It's just something has not translated as a starter yet for him full time. And so the only break Georgia Tech has coming in is this element of you get to play in a national profile. They played really well there last year. The juices, the emotions are going to be flowing. And you get a team that, while the defense, I mean, I think that defensive line is going to be unbelievable this year. There could be some things they're still trying to figure out on offense. Now, I don't think Clemson's a team that Georgia Tech would want to play week 7, week 8. But week 1, that's when you're going to get your best shot at them. There's still maybe some question marks going into that. But I think Clemson prevails just because of how good that defense is as the offense tries to figure things out the course of the season. Western Carolina, you talked about. Man, you get to Ole Miss, and that Ole Miss is going to be one of the biggest question marks in the SEC. A lot of turnover. They lost some coordinators. It's all about chemistry. If the chemistry works for them this year, they're going to be unbelievable. Zach Evans in the backfield is going to be nasty. Georgia fans very familiar with the Zach Evans saga.
He could be the best player on Ole Miss's team by the end of the season.
He could. Whoever starts at quarterback, whether it's Altmaier or Jackson Dart, I know those two guys are still battling it out. That's going to be very interesting. It's a high-powered offense. I personally would never bet against Lane Kiffin. You kind of mentioned that earlier. He's just an offensive wizard. And then you go to UCF, which, if you lose to Clemson and Ole Miss, as a Georgia Tech fan, there's no shame in that. Those are two programs that are just head and shoulders better than you right now. Like, as long as you're competitive, it can't be how the season ended last year, combined 100-0 to Notre Dame and Georgia. But if you lose those games and you show some fight, okay, you tip your cap, say, we just got to get better. But the UCF game, if Georgia Tech is clicking on all cylinders, and you talked about it, they've got a dynamic quarterback in Jeff Sims, who I think is his potential. He just has not been consistent enough or healthy enough to really live up to what people thought he could be. If they could somehow sneak that one and leave 3-3, man, that's not bad. Like that's not terrible.
That would definitely have some momentum. That would definitely bring some momentum into that bye week and getting ready for that back half of the schedule. If that's the case, but the thing is, right? Listen, the bounce house is a wild place to play.
Ooh, it's tough.
It's wild, right?
Yeah.
So it's not going to be easy regardless, right? But you're going to have – I feel like if I'm Georgia Tech, I have to play B+, A- football, and even more possibly to beat them on the road.
Yeah.
And if you can, that's huge. That's
It is
huge
huge.
for the move, for the momentum. Because listen, I'll pull this back up to kind of, preface this. You're going through a gauntlet. You're going to be, in my opinion, you're going to be 1-2 going into that matchup, right? It'll be Georgia Tech's first road game. So you're going to find out some adversity early. It's just what's going to happen. But what is the team made of? We'll find out in 3 weeks. But at the same time, it's hard to really gauge when you're looking at, Clemson and Ole Miss and then Western Carolina. What's that going to look like? If you're clicking, it's an expected matchup, right? You should expect to win that. But if you don't, some real problems are going to, transpire from that to the point where, listen, Jeff Collins' seat might be too hot to sit on if you're not careful.
Yeah.
So, and then listen, after you Florida to Pitt and manage that, right? We don't know what Pitt's going to look like. We don't. But nonetheless, the expectations at Pitt with them coming off that ACC championship are still going to be high. And the talent is probably should be better than what Georgia Tech has to offer. So if you could, depending on how things go, if Georgia Tech goes 3-3 into the bye week, that's huge for Jeff Collins and that team. That's huge. Absolutely huge. We're going to talk about the second half after this quick break. So stay tuned, and we're going to talk the second half of Georgia Tech's schedule after this. We are back, and let's talk second half of Georgia Tech and their schedule, right? So as we talked about first, they ended up week 6 hosting Duke. And then you have your bye week. And after that, to start the back half, it's a Thursday night game, if I'm not mistaken, in Atlanta, hosting Virginia. Then you go to Tallahassee and then to Blacksburg, two insanely difficult places to play. And then you bring in Miami. There's the talk of the ACC, holy. And then you go to 2 trips to end the season. You go to Chapel Hill, and then you take the little bus ride down to Athens. With that being said, Bryce, I'm going to give my analysis, and then I'll let you explain further here. This is not easy. Not easy. And as bad as it sounds, you might go 1-5 here, but it might not surprise me if you go 0-6 in this back half, because for Georgia Tech standpoint, this looks brutal. Yeah. Even with Florida State being down, the talent level that they have is still head and shoulders above Georgia Tech. Virginia Tech, Lane Stadium is just one of these places where the environment alone can impact the game to the point where teams can lose games based off of that. Miami, right? Year 1 under Coach Cristobal, time will tell what that team looks like. But again, the talent is just, there. Just get the coaching staff has got to get right. Mm-hmm. North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, Drake May just got announced as their starter. Yeah. How is that going to look? I think that's a questionable game, but I still think it's a situation where North Carolina just has too much talent, and you're on the road in Chapel Hill. Keenan Memorial is not, in my opinion, not as difficult as a Florida State or Virginia Tech, but it's still difficult. And then obviously ending it off with clean old-fashioned hate. Listen, at this point, 45-0 last season, I feel like a moral victory would be just not getting shut out. And I think Georgia Tech can score, but we'll see, right? But I don't see Georgia Tech being – I think it's a moral victory if you are remotely competitive for 2 quarters. Like, it's just that much of a talent gap between Georgia Tech and Georgia. And it's not knocking Georgia Tech. It's just where, right? It's just where the programs are. Right? Mm-hmm. There's no way to sugarcoat that. Overall, that back half, what do you see in that back half?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it depends on the viewpoint of if you were to steal the game at UCF, okay, and you get to 3-3, you look at that back half and say, is there anywhere that I can find 3 wins? And a lot, look, we talk about it here in middle or late August. A lot of things are going to look different at that back half of the schedule. There's going to be some storylines. Maybe there's injuries to a couple of those teams. But I think you start with Virginia. Listen, Brennan Armstrong is a dynamic quarterback. The ACC has some really good quarterbacks in the league. And Georgia Tech avoids probably, in my opinion, the best one in Devin O'Leary at NC State. That kid's they avoid him. He's
Sam Hartman, if he comes back,
yeah.
If he comes back, I don't know the whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
But had the medical situation not occurred, you also avoided Hartman.
Yeah, so you avoid those top 2 guys. I think
State and Wake are going to be interested as hell to see this season. But like you said, Georgia Tech doesn't have to see those teams this year.
Yeah, they don't have to see those teams, and that's a good thing. So Virginia with Brennan Armstrong, listen, they lost a lot of the offensive line. Armstrong has struggled to stay completely healthy his entire career. That's a game. You have some things going for you. And the fact that if, Tech scored against Virginia last year, I don't think that's a question. It's more, can the defense get stops? And if you can find a way to slow down Armstrong, you do have going, which is a program that struggles with attendance right now. Like we saw the last game of the season in Georgia Tech. It's a Thursday night. Students are still going to be on campus. It's a school night. So that place is going to be packed out, in my opinion. Just because Thursday night games, typically Bobby Dodd do very, very well. So that's a game. Maybe you find a way to win that game. Florida State is going to be interesting because this is obviously where it's been really weird. Tech has had Florida State's number the past couple times they played them.
It's crazy. I feel like
it's really weird.
So much.
It's really weird.
Florida State under Norvell has just been the epitome of you're playing
it's just
up
been
to
weird.
Teams. You lose to Jacksonville State at home.
Yeah,
it's so hit or miss. I think if you go 1-0 or 1-5, I think that might be a low key 2-4 game. I'm going to pull the graphic back up for those that are looking at this. And what I've got here, I think that you can beat Virginia. I think it can happen. But it wouldn't surprise me if Florida State played down to the point where they just lost. Right? Yeah. So the 1-5 could either go either way because of just how inconsistent Florida State's been. It's so weird. So weird how that played out.
Yeah, we also have to recognize the fact that Virginia and Virginia Tech are both breaking in brand new coaches. That's a new thing. So there's a lot of coaching changes across the ACC to where that back half of the schedule, like you said, I mean, if Georgia Tech 3-3 is going to, in between 1-5, there's a lot of different locker room vibes between that. If you're 3-3 going into Virginia, you're feeling really, really good about yourself. If you're 1-5, I can't tell you what the temperature of that locker room is going to be. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on what happens before that. And 1-5, and look, this is something that we don't talk a lot about kind of on our coverage of things. But I'll say this: 1-5. I mean, what are the chances that Jeff Collins is still in as the head coach after a 1-5 start? I don't think it's very high, and I agree with you. I don't think it's high. So it'll be very interesting to kind of see what the front half is going to dictate the back half. There's winnable games. It depends on what kind of Georgia Tech team shows up. I don't think that there's one game on the back half outside of the Georgia game where you're like, we don't have a shot. There's no chance. Because if Georgia Tech were to beat Georgia, I mean, we're talking about an upset of amazing magnitude. I mean, it would be
literally
unbelievable.
Talking David Goliath, literally David Goliath.
So outside of that game, it depends on what happens on the front half. If things are rolling and they're playing well, because 3-3 for that first half is not bad. I mean, that's respectable. It's whatever.
Consider
the back half,
non-conference matchups.
Yeah. So the back half, in my opinion, there's winnable games. And you also see it's another thing. Tech, if you go back and look at recent years, they've played Miami very close. It's been weird. Miami's not blowing them out. 33-30 loss last year, where Tech had the lead late in the game. They're just wildly inconsistent. That's the best thing I can say about Georgia Tech. And a lot of people have a sour taste in their mouths because of how the last two games ended. And look, those were both top 10 programs, Notre Dame and Georgia. There's no shame in losing, but the way you lost the game was bad. And I think part of it was because a lot of guys were just kind of checked out. Now those guys are gone. You have kind of a new, you have different Jeff Collins players. You had Paul Johnson players last year still playing in the program. Now you have a group that, they say they're bought in. Everyone says that in fall camp, but you have that. And so I think that this team is not as bad as the record has indicated. They are just one of the most wildly inconsistent programs over the past 3 years. I mean, if they play like they did against North Carolina last year, you're talking about a team that was probably 7-5, 8-4. Outside of those last two games, the margin of victory was no more than like 10 points in some of those losses. So, I mean, it's not like they were getting blown out. Everyone just remembers. It's recency bias. You know that. I mean, it's what we remember last. We remember the Notre Dame and Georgia game. We don't remember the close losses to Miami, Florida, beating Florida State in 2020. So it's going to be interesting to see how this season plays out.
Ultimately, I have it, and I'll pull the graphic back up. I've got 3-9 again, but I don't see Jeff Collins sticking around after another 3-9 season. If you go 2-10, he might be gone before Georgia.
Yeah.
Because just from the standpoint of this game, right, the clean old fashioned hate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Does he stick around until right? Because if going into Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
you might see him stick around until after the Georgia game. But if you're 2-9 going into the Georgia game, there might be a chance you have somebody playing your interim head coach.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there will be, but I'm saying there could be.
Yeah, and the financials get in the way of that too because he's got a $10 million buyout. I dropped, but what's crazy though is Tech's not financially, as of right now, they're not really financially free to be able to pay a $10 million buyout and hire a quality coach to come in, and that's a tough spot to sit in. Now I'll say this, and this is the worst part about it, and we'll give some more Tech fans some doom and gloom on this. It's a $10 million buyout. In January, which is already after early signing day, the buyout drops to $7 million. Could you even take the risk of firing a coach before, or I'm sorry, when the buyout drops, and then the which is still a massive transfer portal recruiting time? You don't have a head coach, so it's just going to be. That's why, really and truthfully, there was so much done to upheave and redo the offensive staff because this is a massive year for Georgia Tech. They've got to find a way to get to 5 or 6 wins to instill some type of confidence into the program.
Even 4, Bryce. I would say even 4. Show some sort of progression.
Some sort of progression. And the biggest thing is you have to show, Chip Long's first year, you've got to show something to where if you're sitting there, and I've said this multiple times, if you're sitting there at 4-8, yeah, I know that's 1 win better. But if you can tell me that Jeff Sims looks way better in Chip Long's offense, and you know what? If we just get another year of Chip Long, that's you don't know what can happen his senior year. So there's just so many variables to it, man. It's going to be an interesting season. It's really is.
Well, you've got Sims, right? But then you also in the 22 cycle you bring in Zach Pyron, right, out of Alabama, I think it is.
Yes.
If the record is 3-9. But you say the record's 3-9, but you see offensive progression, you see better development, you see, right? You talk about the overhaul, you see those dividends starting to pay off. It's just like maybe you know what I mean. Like it's just something where you saw the guys get better and you played better, but it just wasn't enough. Do you see the coaching staff stay put for another year? Because then I think Sims will also be able to, or he'll be draft eligible after this year, but he might stick around. You don't know. Yeah. If he were to go, then you have, Pyron or whoever quarterback, is there. It's a real conundrum of a situation to be in. You hope for that development. You hope for the progression and enticing the boosters and the people that, let's be honest, the people that pay those checks to say, look, our record is what it is, but did you see what progression we made as in the quarterback room? The receiving core got better, right? We fixed these problems. We just need more time.
Yeah.
I think that's the situation that, you're probably going to be in, but you just got to hope that things look better, because if they don't, then you're in a really nightmare situation where you're in a basically a purgatory of do we suck it up and pay $10 million? Can we pay $10 million? Or do we need to cut the $3 million in January, take our losses, and then hope that nobody really leaves through the portal because it's
Yeah.
going to happen. It happened with Tennessee, although a different situation, right? Different
Mm-hmm.
context there. Look, Tennessee got plucked and just plucked and plucked. It was just depleted. But Georgia Tech could do the same thing. You got to be very careful, walk the fine line. But if I'm a Georgia Tech fan, I'm nervous, and you really want to see something happen this season.
Yeah.
To make you feel somewhat comfortable moving forward. You've had 3 years, and you mentioned this earlier in the broadcast, in the podcast, everything. Be patient, right? It's worked with Stoops at Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there's so many fan bases and so many athletic departments that aren't patient enough to give these coaches enough time. I don't think they think about how difficult it is to reestablish a culture, cycle out former players, right? Not your players. Cycle that. Because listen, tell me when Paul Johnson left, and I think Jeff Collins was the coach there after that,
Mm-hmm.
how difficult is it to replace an option offense with players that were built to run the option and not a prototypical modern day offense? It's super difficult.
Yeah.
But you have to be patient to let these guys recruit, get these things in there. But at the same time, you also get it because if I'm paying the money for these guys,
Mm-hmm.
I want to see results. And I don't want to get set back even more for making poor decisions. Like a la Dan Mullen at Florida. Didn't focus on recruiting. PR nightmare at times, let's be honest. Billy Napier's playing a lot of cleanup right now and doing a damn good job at it, as much as that hates me to say that.
Mm-hmm.
He's doing a lot of good things there in Gainesville. It's the same thing, right? You have to. Now, what hurts Jeff Collins is being that guy that replaced, you're replacing Paul Johnson, and that's difficult. That's difficult.
Yeah.
Because there was some success at Georgia Tech that outside of the very far time in history, you didn't see that. You didn't see a lot. I mean, you had back in it was at 90, I think it was, where you shared the title.
Yeah.
Outside of that, it's not been good.
No.
Until Paul Johnson, and you had, like I said, those seasons with, Demaryius Thomas, things like that, like Calvin Johnson back in the day. That was crazy to think that Paul Johnson could get those guys on the team. That was wild.
And what's crazy to think about too is Jeff Collins was an assistant, a grad assistant, and helped with the recruitment of Calvin Johnson early on in his career. It's crazy. So it's a guy that loves the program. He wants to see it succeed. But you mentioned it. It is a hard thing to do. I mean, I think it's one of the toughest things doing college football, transitioning from an option style and not a spread option, not like kind of what Auburn ran or what Coastal Carolina runs. This is a straight up this is what Georgia Southern ran back in the day, and this is kind of the same this is the same offense that your military academies run. I mean, you're running a triple option, and you're trying to transform it and be competitive. I mean, it's just it wasn't feasible. But I'll say this, and to kind of end it off like this, is that the biggest thing for me and what the biggest disappointment has been is that the defense was never supposed to be as bad as they were. The offense, okay, you knew there was going to be a growing period. Georgia Tech would have won 7 games if the defense would have played better. Secondary was abysmal. They were almost second to last in pass defense. I mean, it was terrible. So as a team, you're like, us running the option shouldn't affect anything on the defensive side of the football. They were just historically bad last year. And I think that's where the disappointment's been.
I think, and I hate to do this, but as a Georgia fan, this is going to bring a lot of joy to me, but disdain for everyone else. To me, the defense was summed up by Brock Bowers literally running through your defense on a slant route last year.
Yeah.
I get it, right? Brock Bowers, let's be honest, he's not a typical tight end. He's an avatar playing tight end, okay? But the thing about it is, from a defensive standpoint, it's almost a fundamental lapse watching that play happen because he ran straight through your defense. You didn't even take the right angles. The safety got left in the dust. Like, that's crazy considering it was a slant route. So there was, I'm not trying to shit on Georgia Tech too much. Yeah. But there was a lot of fundamental lapses, and that just was the epitome of that. Like, I felt like it was like basically the wrapping, right? The gift wrap. It was just like,
Yeah, it was.
Sealed it in. It just wasn't good.
Yeah, it wasn't good. I mean, not good at all. And I think the secondary was bad, no doubt about it. There was terrible miscommunication, and then just flat out just not knowing what your job was. I mean, you can't play. You're telling me week 12, week 13, when the Georgia Tech games played, you don't know where you're supposed to be. I mean, if you're a true freshman and you've been playing all year, you're really no longer a true freshman, because you know why? A true freshman in Brock Bowers just ran past you and did his job. So I think I've encouraged a lot of Tech fans to stop comparing yourself to Georgia. It's a completely different league.
You're doing yourself a huge disservice if you try that.
You need to start beating Duke consistently. Beating teams like Louisville. I mean, you need to beat these teams consistently before you even worry about that game. You need to take care of yourself in the ACC slate, because that game right now at the end of the season, I know that kind of comes full circle what we started off the show with. That game right there it's not even close. I mean, it would have to be a F effort from Georgia and an A++ effort from Georgia Tech for the Jackets to really win that game.
Thing up with this, saying this, Georgia Tech has the potential to progress, and even listen, don't sit there. I think this is any fan base. Any fan base can do this. There's levels to this.
Tiers,
You can't expect a team like Georgia Tech to try to compare themselves realistically to a Georgia, because Georgia and Alabama are almost, how you want to look at it, you're even or you're right there, 1A, 1B. You can't compare. And you hear this all the time. And it's not just Georgia Tech. Any fan base has these people. Any fan base has these kind of people. You can't sit there and realistically think that if we beat Georgia, that's going to do something for your program. You beat them, awesome. But what does that do for your program? Nothing. Beating Duke, beating Louisville or Virginia, right, and doing it more consistently, that does more. That builds the stepping stones to move up the tier system. It just does. Yeah. Beat the teams you're supposed to beat. Occasionally, you can slip away from that win right there, right? But you can't expect to come in and just beat Georgia every year. You want to. I'm not saying you can't want to.
Yeah.
But don't expect it and then think that it's going to do everything for your program, because it just won't. Yeah. And it's not a knock to anybody. It's just the ideology just doesn't, to me, make sense. If you beat Georgia or if you beat a Clemson, right, then more realistically, if you beat Clemson, right, that's a lot of momentum. But then you have to sit there and think, what is that going to do when we play teams like Duke, when we play teams like Pitt? You might take advantage of Pitt, right? I'm not buying the whole Keaton Slovis thing too much, right? Not too much. So you might be able to take advantage of that, right? But the consistency on beating those teams to take the steps up is more important than just beating a Georgia or beating a Clemson one-off. It's just my opinion there. Yeah. But Bryce, I've had you for a hot minute now. With that being said, before we wrap this thing up, tell the people where they can find you and your work, my man.
Yeah, man, appreciate you having me on. It's like we said, it's always fun to talk college football when week 0 is here. But yeah, no, man, look, you can catch all the Georgia Tech coverage. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff on 24/7 Sports, gojackets.com. And then for me, follow me at Bryce_Koon. That's Koon on Twitter. And then follow our podcast as well at The Crowded Booth on you can subscribe on YouTube. It's on Twitter, Instagram, all the whole 9 yards. We do a fantastic job with our crew down here in Columbus, putting that together on the radio throughout East Alabama and West Georgia. So it's a lot of fun. We enjoy it. And like you said, man, always love talking college football.
Yeah, you know what? I'm tired of the point where we're talking hypotheticals. Now you're about to put, total 11. And week 0, then next thing you know, you got week 1. Listen, it's here. I'm excited for it. I'm like I said, I'm so tired of hypothetical talk. But at the same time, we need to understand each other's programs. So that's why this show, if you're a Georgia fan, this is why this is so important, because it just drives home players to know things like that, right? It's just you don't understand how important it is until someone catches you off guard, and you're like, I wish I would have known about that. With that being said, though, Bryce, have a great day. Thanks for coming back, or thanks for coming on for that matter.
Yeah.
And looking forward to this season and seeing how everybody handles themselves, man.
It'll be fun. It'll be fun. Appreciate it, man. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
yes, sir. All right, folks, that's going to wrap it up for us. With that being said, have a great day and go Dogs.